One sentence, and she changed everything. "You just cost us a $10 million misunderstanding," Daniel Carter said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper, something that pulled the entire conference room into a silence so complete you could hear the faint hum of the city 40 floors below. The executives froze, eyes shifting between the billionaire CEO at the head of the glass table and the woman standing beside the projection screen. A woman in a simple navy dress, slightly worn at the seams, her hair pulled back too tightly as if done in a hurry, her posture straight but unpolished. Emily Hayes didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't look embarrassed. She simply met his gaze with a steady calm that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to be just a translator. Moments earlier, she had interrupted a high-stakes negotiation between Daniel's company and a European partner, correcting a single phrase that could shift the entire meaning of the contract. The room had reacted instantly, a few executives exchanging annoyed glances, one whispering under his breath about freelancers overstepping. But Emily continued anyway, her tone respectful yet unwavering, explaining the nuance in the original language with a precision that felt almost surgical. Daniel wasn't watching her words. He had seen confident people before, but this wasn't confidence. This was precision, the kind that didn't belong to someone at her level. He was watching her confidence, the way she didn't rush, didn't stumble, as if she had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. Now, as the corrected clause was re-examined and quietly confirmed by the legal team, the tension shifted, subtle but undeniable, and Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her with a new kind of interest. "You're certain?" he asked, not challenging, but testing. Emily nodded once, her voice softer but no less sure. "Yes, sir. The original phrasing implies conditional exclusivity, not absolute. It changes the risk completely." And there it was again, that clarity, that depth, the kind you don't pick up from textbooks or short-term contracts. A murmur moved through the room, just enough to signal that something had changed, that the translator had just prevented a costly mistake. Daniel's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but recognition. He had spent years in rooms like this, across cities, across countries, and he knew talent when he saw it. But this didn't fit the profile. After the meeting adjourned, people gathered their papers quickly, conversations returning in low, controlled tones, but Daniel remained seated, watching as Emily packed her laptop into a worn leather bag. She didn't linger, didn't draw attention, as if she were already fading back into the background where everyone expected her to belong. "Miss Hayes," Daniel called, his voice carrying just enough authority to stop her. She turned, composed. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Translating," she replied, a slight tilt of her head. "A few years, simple, understated." Daniel stood then, buttoning his jacket, closing the distance between them with measured steps. And before that, for the first time, there was a pause, brief but noticeable. Emily's eyes flickered, not fear, not discomfort, but something buried. "Nothing relevant," she said, offering a controlled smile. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, sensing the gap between the answer and the truth, a gap far more interesting than anything on paper. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan stretched endlessly, a city built on ambition and secrets. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, Daniel Carter had the distinct feeling that Emily Hayes was carrying both. "You're not just a translator," he said quietly. Emily didn't respond, but the silence between them said enough. And as she turned to leave, Daniel's curiosity didn't fade. It sharpened into something he wasn't going to let go. She walked out of the room, but not out of his attention. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, and only then did Emily allow herself to exhale, the breath leaving slowly as if she had been holding it since the moment Daniel Carter called her name. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel walls, composed on the surface, but carrying a tension she couldn't quite shake. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag, her fingers brushing the frayed edge, grounding herself in something familiar, because everything about the world she had just stepped out of felt too sharp, too observant, especially him. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, her expression had settled again, the calm returning as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just disrupted a room full of executives. Outside, the late afternoon air was cool, The city moving at its usual relentless pace, people passing without a second glance, and just like that, she disappeared into it. Another face in the crowd. Across the street, she slipped into a small cafe with fogged windows, the kind of place where no one asked questions, ordering the cheapest thing on the menu without hesitation, the barista barely looking up. She took a seat by the window, opening her laptop, but her eyes didn't follow the screen, instead replaying the meeting, the moment she spoke, the silence that followed, and most of all, the way Daniel had looked at her, not irritated, not dismissive, curious, the kind that didn't let go. That was a mistake, she murmured under her breath, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true, because part of her had chosen to speak. Across the city, Daniel stood by his office window, Manhattan stretching endlessly below him, but his focus wasn't on the skyline. "Find everything you can on Emily Hayes," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. His assistant paused briefly before nodding. "Already moving. Employment history, education, references, anything," he added. Minutes later, the results appeared: freelance translator, short-term contracts, no major affiliations, nothing notable, a life that looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. Daniel frowned slightly, scrolling again, slower this time, searching for something that matched what he had seen, but it wasn't there. "That doesn't make sense," he said quietly. Daniel didn't like loose ends, and Emily Hayes had just become one. Because people with that level of precision didn't come from nowhere. Back in the cafe, Emily closed her laptop, the untouched coffee cooling in front of her as she checked the time, already calculating her next move, her next job, the next place she could go where no one would look too closely. Her phone buzzed softly against the table, and for a moment she hesitated before picking it up, her expression tightening just slightly as she read the message, a single line that reached further than it should have. She locked the screen quickly, slipping the phone back into her bag as if hiding it could undo what she had just seen, but it didn't. Outside, the city moved on, unaware, but somewhere between a quiet cafe and a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, something had already begun to shift, because while Emily Hayes tried to disappear again, Daniel Carter had already started looking for her, and he wasn't the kind of man who stopped halfway. By the next morning, something was wrong, and she felt it before she could explain it. The city moved the same way it always did, fast, indifferent, loud in all the familiar ways. But to Emily there was a subtle shift beneath it, something that made the air feel tighter as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone as it buzzed again on the small wooden table beside her. The apartment was barely large enough for what she needed: a narrow mattress, a compact desk, and a single window facing a brick wall just a few feet away. But it had always been enough because it was temporary, because everything in her life was designed to be temporary. The phone buzzed again, another unknown number, and she let it ring, the screen dimming before lighting up again almost immediately. Another call, followed by a voicemail notification she didn't open. "Not now," she murmured, running a hand through her hair before standing, crossing the small space toward the window, and pressing her palm lightly against the cool glass as if it might steady her thoughts. She didn't like patterns, she noticed them, and this was becoming one. Across town, Daniel was already in his office, earlier than usual, though no one commented, his attention fixed on the report in front of him. "There's a gap," he said quietly, tapping the screen where Emily Hayes' timeline simply stopped. 3 years with no records, no contracts, no trace. His assistant leaned closer, suggesting it could be incomplete data, but Daniel shook his head. "No, it's too clean," he replied, his voice low and certain, the kind of clean that wasn't accidental. "People don't disappear from records unless they want to," he added, pausing just long enough, "or unless someone makes them." He had built his career on reading people correctly the first time, and something about her told him he hadn't. The words lingered. Back in her apartment, Emily was already moving, fast, efficient, her clothes simple and neutral, chosen without hesitation, her movements practiced, as if she had done this before, because she had. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she looked, just long enough to read the first few words, her expression barely changing, but something in her eyes sharpening. She locked the screen immediately, slipping the phone into her bag. She grabbed her jacket, pausing only for a second at the door before stepping out. The hallway was empty, the elevator ride down slower than usual, each floor marked by a soft chime that echoed too clearly in the confined space. And when the doors opened, the city rushed in again, normal, busy, unaware. She stepped into it without hesitation, blending into the flow of people who never looked twice at anyone around them. What she didn't see was the black car parked half a block away, engine running, windows tinted, a man inside watching the entrance with quiet focus before lifting his phone. "She just came out," he said. On the other end, Daniel didn't respond immediately, his attention already shifting from the report to something far more immediate. "Keep your distance," he said finally. This wasn't something he normally pursued personally, which was exactly why he didn't ignore it. His tone controlled, because whatever Emily Hayes was hiding, it wasn't something you chased directly. Out on the street, Emily turned the corner without looking back, her pace steady but deliberate. But this time she wasn't as invisible as she believed, because somewhere behind her, unseen but constant, she was already being watched, and whatever she had left behind was no longer waiting, it was moving toward her. She thought she had left that part of her life behind, but some things don't stay buried. The hours passed without direction, the steady rhythm of the co-working space doing little to anchor her focus as Emily sat in the far corner, her laptop open, the screen filled with words she hadn't truly read, her fingers hovering over the keyboard longer than they should have, because her mind wasn't there. It was caught in the echo of a message she hadn't answered and a feeling she couldn't ignore. The room itself was ordinary. Freelancers moving in and out, quiet conversations blending into a constant hum. Everything exactly as it should be, and yet none of it felt stable anymore. Her phone buzzed again, sharper this time, pulling her attention instantly, and for a moment she didn't move, as if ignoring it might delay whatever was waiting. But it buzzed again, insistent, and she finally picked it up, her thumb pausing before unlocking the screen. The message was short, direct, and far too familiar. "We need to talk, Emily. You can't keep ignoring this." And beneath it, a name she hadn't seen in years, a name that tightened something deep in her chest. Marcus. She inhaled slowly, locking the screen again almost immediately, as if closing it could contain what had already surfaced, but it didn't. She stood abruptly, closing her laptop in one motion, drawing a few glances she didn't notice, her focus already shifting, her instincts taking over in a way that was too practiced to be accidental. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the street as she stepped into the flow of people, her pace quicker now, more deliberate, her path no longer random but chosen, adjusting through turns without hesitation. A block away, the same black car eased forward, maintaining distance with quiet precision, the driver watching her through reflections before lifting his phone. "She's moving again," he said, high above the street. Daniel Carter stood near his office window, listening without interruption, his expression unreadable as the pieces continued to align in his mind, not forming a complete picture yet, but enough to confirm this was no longer curiosity. "Stay on her," he said calmly, not because she was a risk, but because she didn't fit into any category he understood. "And don't get close, because whatever Emily Hayes was involved in, it wasn't something that revealed itself under pressure." Across the city, Emily turned into a quieter street lined with older buildings, her awareness sharper now, her eyes scanning without appearing to, until she reached a small cafe tucked between storefronts, the kind of place where conversations stayed contained. She stepped inside, the soft chime above the door barely noticeable as she moved toward the back corner, choosing a seat with a clear view of the entrance, a habit she hadn't unlearned. After a moment, she reached for her phone again, unlocking it this time, reading the message fully. "I told you it was over," she murmured, though there was no certainty in it. The cafe door chimed again, louder this time, and something in the air shifted, subtle but immediate, the kind of shift you feel before you see. Emily's gaze lifted instinctively, her body stilling just slightly as the figure stepped inside, familiar in a way that made the space feel smaller. He didn't hesitate, didn't scan the room, he already knew where she would be. "You always did prefer the corner seat," Marcus said, his voice calm, controlled, carrying the weight of a past she hadn't escaped. Emily didn't react immediately, her expression settling into something guarded before she looked up. Marcus, she said evenly, but the name carried more history than the word alone could hold, because this wasn't just someone from her past walking in. It was the past she had been trying to outrun finally catching up. You don't get to walk away from a life like that, not without consequences. Emily didn't speak immediately after he sat down, her fingers resting lightly on her phone as if grounding herself in something present, something she could still control, while everything about Marcus pulled her back into something she had spent years avoiding. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed entirely at ease, as if this meeting had always been inevitable, his posture relaxed but precise. His attention fixed on her in a way that wasn't intrusive but wasn't casual either. You changed your number, he said, his tone observational rather than accusatory. People change, Emily replied, her voice even, controlled, giving him nothing beyond the surface. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, not amused, just acknowledging the deflection. Not that much, he said quietly, and the weight behind those words lingered. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent, but inside the cafe the air felt tighter, heavier, as if time had slowed. Just enough to force the past and present into the same space. They're still looking for you, Marcus continued, lowering his voice slightly, not out of secrecy, but because the statement itself carried enough weight. Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her gaze steady even as something flickered beneath it. I'm not part of that world anymore, she said, each word deliberate, as if repetition might make it true. Marcus leaned back slightly, studying her, not with doubt, but with quiet certainty. You don't get to decide that alone, he replied, calm but firm. There are things that don't disappear just because you walk away. Emily exhaled slowly, her composure slipping for only a fraction of a second before settling again. I didn't walk away, she said softly, her voice lower now, carrying something deeper beneath the control. I survived. That was the first honest thing she had said, and they both knew it. Marcus didn't respond immediately, his expression shifting just enough to show he understood more than he was saying. Then why are you still hiding? He asked, and this time it didn't sound like pressure. It sounded like truth. Emily's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, reflections of passing cars flickering across the glass like fragments of a life she had already lived, before returning to him. Because the moment I stop, she said quietly, everything I left behind catches up with me. And there was no fear in her voice, only certainty. Marcus leaned forward slightly then, the shift small but intentional. That moment is already here, he said, and for the first time there was no space left for interpretation. Emily didn't respond right away, but something in her posture changed, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that comes from recognition. Outside, unseen, a car remained parked at the curb, a figure watching without drawing attention, while across the city, decisions were already being made that would intersect with this moment whether she chose to engage or not. Inside the cafe, the silence stretched just long enough to become something heavier. Then you didn't come here just to warn me, Emily said finally, her eyes locking onto his. Marcus held her gaze without hesitation. No, he said simply. I came to bring you back. And just like that, the distance she had built between herself and everything she had left behind collapsed, because this wasn't a warning anymore. It was the beginning of her return. She didn't just leave that world, she was forced out of it. Emily didn't react immediately to his last words, but something in her expression settled, not into denial, not into resistance, but into a stillness that only came when the truth was no longer avoidable. Her fingers slowly moved away from her phone, as if whatever control it offered no longer mattered. The company you walked away from is being dismantled piece by piece, Marcus continued, his tone quieter now, more deliberate, and the words landed, not visibly, but in the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her gaze dropped for a fraction of a second before returning to him. That's not my concern anymore, she said, but the certainty wasn't there in the same way, and Marcus noticed. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a thin envelope and placing it on the table, sliding it forward just enough for her to take it without forcing the moment. It becomes your concern when your name is still attached to it, he said calmly. Emily stared at the envelope without touching it, her pulse steady but heavier now, because she already knew what it represented, the kind of documents that never arrived without consequences. "I signed everything away," she said, lifting her gaze back to his, searching for something that would make this easier to dismiss. Marcus shook his head slowly. "You signed under pressure," he replied. "Under circumstances that are now being questioned, legally and publicly." Pausing just long enough for the implication to settle. "Which means your absence isn't protecting you anymore. It's exposing you." The silence that followed pressed down between them until Emily finally reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope before pulling it closer, though she didn't open it immediately, because opening it meant stepping back into a life she had spent years escaping. Across the cafe, unnoticed, a man remained seated near the counter, his posture relaxed but his attention fixed. Daniel didn't need to hear the conversation to recognize tension when he saw it. And whatever tied her to that man, it wasn't simple, his gaze catching their reflection in the glass without drawing attention. Daniel Carter didn't need to hear the conversation to understand the shift, the tension, the weight in Emily's posture that hadn't been there before, and it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that Emily Hayes was connected to something far larger. And for the first time, Daniel realized this wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about something he had completely misjudged. Then she allowed anyone to see. Back at the table, Emily finally opened the envelope, her movements controlled, pulling out a set of documents far too formal for a casual meeting, her eyes scanning line by line, and with each page, the calm she had built around herself began to fracture, not outwardly, but in the tightening of her grip, the slight change in her breathing. "They can't do this without me," she murmured under her breath. And the moment the words left her, everything shifted. Because those weren't the words of someone disconnected. They were the words of someone who still had authority, still had ownership, still had a place. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "That's exactly why they need you back," he said. "Not as the person you've been pretending to be, but as who you really are." Emily looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, the version of her that had been invisible disappeared completely, replaced by something sharper, something that carried weight. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. But inside that small cafe, the truth had already surfaced, and whether she wanted it or not, the life she left behind wasn't waiting anymore. It was pulling her back. For the first time in years, she didn't have a way out. The paper in Emily's hands felt heavier with every passing second, not because of what it weighed, but because of what it demanded, and for the first time in a long time, she couldn't map out an exit before the situation closed in on her. "If I go back," she said slowly, her voice measured but carrying a sharper edge than before, "I don't get to walk away again." And Marcus didn't interrupt, didn't soften the truth. He simply nodded, because they both understood what that meant. "No, you don't," he replied quietly. "But if you don't, everything your father built will be erased, and everything you tried to protect by leaving will disappear anyway." The words landed with precision, not harsh, but unavoidable, and Emily leaned back slightly, her gaze dropping to the documents again as if searching for an alternative that didn't exist. Across the cafe, Daniel remained seated, outwardly disengaged, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, but his attention fixed in a way that had nothing to do with the surface of the moment, his gaze catching fragments of posture, expression, tension, piecing together a story he had underestimated her once already. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. That wasn't being spoken out loud, and what he saw now was different, not just curiosity, but weight, responsibility, something tied to history. Emily exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening against the paper before releasing it. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked, lifting her gaze back to Marcus, her voice steady, controlled, but no longer distant. Marcus didn't hesitate this time. "Then the board proceeds without you," he said, "and the decisions they make won't be in your favor." He paused briefly before adding, "And neither will the outcome." That was the line that mattered, not because it threatened her directly, but because it confirmed what she already knew, that staying hidden was no longer protection. It was surrender. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment, noticing the faint imprint left by her grip, a small detail grounding her in the present even as everything else pulled her back. For a second, the cafe faded, the noise, the movement, all of it dissolving as her mind moved through consequences she could no longer avoid. When she finally straightened, the shift was subtle but undeniable, her posture aligning in a way that no longer belonged to someone trying to disappear, but to someone stepping back into something larger. "I need time," she said, not as a request, but as a decision beginning to take shape. Marcus accepted it with a quiet nod. "You have 48 hours, he replied, standing and placing a card on the table before stepping back, giving her space, giving her the illusion of choice even though they both knew the decision had already begun forming the moment she opened that envelope. As he walked away, Emily remained seated, her gaze fixed on the card, on the name printed across it, on the life she had convinced herself no longer belonged to her. Outside, the black car pulled away slowly, its purpose complete for now, while Daniel Carter stepped out onto the sidewalk moments later, his attention still anchored to the woman inside, his thoughts already shifting, recalculating. Because whatever decision Emily Hayes was about to make, it was no longer just going to change her life, it was about to intersect with his in a way neither of them could walk away from. She thought she could still walk away, but this time, he didn't let her. The cafe felt quieter after Marcus left, as if the air itself had settled into something heavier, something waiting, and Emily remained seated for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly on the envelope as though it might move on its own if she let go. Outside, the city continued without pause, headlights passing, voices blending into a constant hum. But inside her mind, everything had narrowed to a single, unavoidable question. What happens if she goes back? She stood finally, slipping the envelope into her bag with a controlled motion, her decision not yet spoken but already beginning to take shape in the steadiness of her movements, the way her posture aligned, the way hesitation faded. Stepping outside, the cool evening air brushed against her face, grounding her, reminding her she was still in control, at least for now. She turned down the street without hesitation, but only made it a few steps before a voice behind her broke through that illusion with quiet precision. "You're not very good at disappearing," Daniel Carter said, his tone calm, almost conversational, as if he had simply caught up to her by chance. Emily stopped, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge the interruption before turning to face him, her expression composed, guarded, though her eyes were sharper now, more aware. "And you're not very subtle," she replied evenly, a faint edge beneath the calm. Daniel inclined his head slightly, accepting the observation without argument, his gaze steady on hers, studying without apology. "You left before I could ask you something," he said, taking a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the moment intentional. "About what?" Emily asked, though the question was more formality than curiosity, because she already knew it wasn't about translation anymore. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to her bag, catching the subtle shift in her posture, the weight she carried now, before returning to her face. "About who you really are," he said quietly, not accusing, not demanding, simply stating what had already become obvious to him. Emily held his gaze without flinching, but something in her expression shifted, not denial, not deflection, but calculation, as if she were deciding how much truth this moment required. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice softer now, but no less controlled. Daniel didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to give the question weight. "It matters if it changes everything, because somewhere between the first meeting and this moment, Daniel Carter had already realized he had been wrong about her from the start," he said, his tone steady, but there was something different in it now, something less like curiosity, and more like recognition. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting for just a second before returning to him, and in that brief pause, the version of herself she had been maintaining slipped, just slightly, revealing something deeper beneath. "It already has," she said quietly, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than anything else she could have said. A car passed behind them, its headlights cutting across the space, casting sharp lines of light and shadow over their faces, and, for a moment, everything else faded. The noise, the movement, the city itself narrowing to just this exchange, this collision of two lives that had no reason to intersect, and yet had. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself rather than asking for more. "Then don't disappear again," he said, his voice quieter now, not a command, not even a request, but something closer to inevitability. Emily didn't respond immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, the envelope inside feeling heavier than ever, her past pressing forward, her future narrowing into a path she could no longer avoid. She looked at him one last time, really looked this time, seeing not just the man who had been watching her, but someone who was about to step into something far more complex than he realized. "I was never gone," she said softly, and with that, she turned, stepping back into the current of the city, but this time, she wasn't trying to disappear. She was walking straight toward everything she had been trying to leave behind. 48 hours later, she didn't come back quietly. The boardroom was already filled when the clock struck the hour, the air thick with a quiet, controlled tension that didn't need raised voices to be felt. Executives seated around the long polished table, their expressions composed but expectant, their attention drifting toward the empty chair at the head of the room. Beyond the glass walls, Manhattan stretched endlessly, sharp and indifferent, as if it had seen moments like this play out 1,000 times before. Power shifting, control, changing hands without hesitation. Daniel Carter stood near the window, his posture relaxed but his focus precise, watching not as a participant, but as something more invested than he had intended to be, because whatever this was, it had already moved beyond curiosity. The door opened quietly, and every conversation stopped at once. Emily Hayes stepped inside. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, her presence measured, deliberate, and completely different from the woman who had once stood in that room unnoticed, because there was nothing uncertain about her now, nothing hesitant, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that didn't belong to someone trying to blend in, but to someone who no longer needed to. The room adjusted around her without being told to, subtle shifts in posture, attention, recognition, as if something that had been overlooked was now impossible to ignore. Marcus rose from his seat, giving a small nod, not introduction, but acknowledgement, and Emily returned it without breaking stride. She moved to the head of the table and stopped, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting each pair of eyes without flinching, without rushing, and in that moment, there was no trace of the version of her that had hidden in plain sight, only clarity, only presence. "I believe this seat is still mine," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the room without force, and no one interrupted, no one challenged her, because the authority in her tone didn't allow for it. One of the board members cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Miss Hayes, we were under the impression that you had relinquished your position," he began. But Emily didn't sit yet. She simply placed the envelope on the table in front of her, sliding it forward just enough to make its presence undeniable. "Under conditions that are now being reviewed," she replied, her words precise, informed, and impossible to dismiss. The shift in the room was immediate, subtle but absolute. Documents exchanged, glances recalculated, positions quietly reconsidered as the balance of power adjusted in real time. Daniel watched it unfold without moving, because this was the answer he had been looking for, not in data, not in files. This was the moment he understood it clearly. He hadn't misread her once, he had misunderstood her entirely. But in presence, in the way she held the room without effort, in the way she no longer needed to explain who she was, Emily finally took her seat, not as someone reclaiming power, but as someone who had always belonged there. "We will proceed," she said calmly, her gaze steady, "with full transparency and with my involvement." And there it was, not a request, not a negotiation, but a fact. The meeting continued, but nothing about it remained the same. Every decision now filtered through a dynamic that hadn't existed before she walked through that door. Hours later, as the room slowly emptied, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of decisions made and paths altered, Emily remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the table. "You knew," she said finally, her voice softer now, directed toward Daniel without turning. He stepped closer, stopping beside her, his gaze steady, not surprised, not impressed, just certain. "I knew you weren't who you said you were," he replied. "I didn't know you were this." And there was no judgment in his tone, only recognition. Emily exhaled slowly, standing and turning to face him fully, the distance between them no longer defined by misunderstanding, but by something more complex, something real. "Now you do," she said quietly, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them no longer empty but filled with everything that had shifted. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unchanged, but inside that room, something had already moved past the point of return, because this wasn't just where Emily Hayes reclaimed her place, it was where everything that connected her to Daniel Carter had truly begun. And this time, he wasn't the one in control anymore.